evening. We're fortunate to be here for a special edition of our Innovations in Education for a Big Bold Future during the first week of the Prichard Committee for Academic Excellence annual meeting, which is completely virtual this year. So this is one of the offerings during our annual meeting. I'm pleased to have a special guest who I will introduce momentarily. Tonight, we're focusing on the future of learning and work. We know increasing educational attainment in Kentucky is the means by which we realize a stronger future and a better quality of life for all Kentuckians. So having a conversation about the future of learning and work, regardless of the pandemic and with the pandemic, what does that future look like and what do we need to be doing now to ensure a bright future for Kentuckians? As we go through our conversation tonight, those who aren't familiar, please pay attention to the Facebook comments. Comment, ask questions. I'll make sure I can ask those questions of our guest as we go along if you have them. Also, know that we will be gathering information to develop the Prichard Committee's next strategic plan. So you'll notice some questions which are posted into the Facebook comments to use an app called Slido and respond to those questions. So please try to answer those questions to give us as much information as you can so that we're designing our work in a way that meets all of our needs. So without further ado, I'll introduce our guest. We're pleased tonight to have Chauncy Lennon with us, who is the Vice President for Learning and Work at the Lumina Foundation. The Lumina Foundation is an independent private foundation in Indianapolis, committed to making opportunities for learning beyond high school available to all. Chauncy came to Lumina in 2018 after nearly 5 years as a managing director and leader of workforce strategy at JP Morgan Chase & Company, and also at the Ford Foundation, where he did work related to economic advancement and workforce development. Since 2015, Chauncy has served on the National Advisory Board of the College Promise Campaign, a nonpartisan national initiative to build public support for funding the first 2 years of higher education for working students, beginning with community colleges. So Chauncy, thank you for taking time out on a Wednesday evening to join us from New York.
Well, I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me.
We also have Kenya McFeeters here with us again, who will be interpreting for the deaf and hard of hearing so that we can make this conversation as accessible as possible to as many Kentuckians. Kenya, thank you for your work with us. I also have to note that today is a very difficult day here in Kentucky, and especially in our largest city of Louisville, as the grand jury ruled in the case of Breonna Taylor, who died at the hands of police this past March. This broadcast tonight we do in her honor and in her memory, as we strive to be part of righting the wrongs of centuries of historic and systemic racism and work together to make Kentucky a place where all individuals are safe and have the opportunity to flourish. So with that in mind, Chauncy, I'd like to start us off in our discussion really focusing on the issue of racial equity and justice through the lens of education. Lumina made an important call for racial equity recently. As a result of that call and your long-standing work, what are you encouraging states to do differently to remedy long-standing systemic racial injustices in education and the workforce?
Great, thank you. Thank you for that question. So I think many of the members of the audience will be familiar with the racial justice and equity issues in post-secondary attainment when it comes to four-year degrees, the BA. We've had a conversation in this country about improving access and completion for students of color to four-year programs. That is critical work. There is much work to be done. We have to think across a whole spectrum of issues around how we help high school students understand their options to get a four-year degree, how we help them navigate to whether it's state regional universities, nonprofits, whatever the case may be. There's much more to do to help students navigate that transition. But I want to speak to a different dimension that does not get the same amount of attention. And that is when it comes to post-secondary attainment, we also have to understand the racial justice and equity dimension of short-term credentials. So this is access to certificates, certifications, and to AA degrees, especially the 2-year A degrees focused on occupations. And this is critical because we have to remember when we talk about post-secondary education, we're not just talking about 18 to 22-year-olds of whatever racial and ethnic background. We're also talking about adults. We're talking about people who are in the workforce and recognize the need to go back and get further learning. We have 36 million adults in this country who have some college and no degree, and we have over 50 million adults who just have high school diplomas. Everybody needs learning past high school. Mm-hmm. And when we look at those populations, we see important equity gaps. There are more people, adults of color, in that 36 million and more adults of color in that 50 million. So we have to recognize that if we don't also focus on the short-term credential end of the post-secondary spectrum, we are not addressing one of the most critical needs we have around creating opportunity. Let me just say a few more words about this. So when we think about this question, we have to recognize that there is not enough being done to help adults in particular, and often adults of color, recognize where these opportunities are. So we have to think about how we can better message to adults what the options are, help them understand, get them better information about what their short-term credential opportunities could be. And that's work that we haven't done enough of, and we need to do more of if we're going to address this important issue. There's lots of other dimensions of this challenge that I'll talk about as we go, but I wanted to raise the sort of very basic idea that people will not come to get credentials if we don't do a better job of explaining to them what the options are and how they can access them. And because we have not really thought through this issue well enough, we are not making the kind of headway we need to make on closing racial justice and equity gaps. Let me say one more thing. You can really see this issue when you look at the population of students in community colleges. There are more students in community colleges getting certificates, certifications, and AA degrees than there are students getting 4-year degrees, right? So most students in post-secondary are in these programs. And if you look at the demographics, most students in the short-term credential programs are students of color, right? So this is where students are gravitating. This is where adult students gravitate. These programs are more affordable. They're more flexible. They meet the needs of working learners and adults with children, and they're more tied to occupations. We know from survey research that when adults go back, they want to go back for something that's very clearly going to help them with their job. So we know that that's where adults of color are gravitating. We have to recognize that, and we have to do more to ensure the quality of the programs that are there waiting for them when they get to community colleges.
So transparency around the information, and I hear you, Chauncy. I think immediately maybe our minds go to those high schoolers and doing better work in high school to attach students to the next step for them after high school, the next post-secondary step. And so that's a critical piece, and how we communicate that.
That's right.
The other piece is how we get that information out to adults currently in the workforce.
That's right. And I think the challenge here is sometimes we say that you can do one or the other, or one as opposed to the other, but really where innovation comes in the decades to come is figuring out how to do both at the same time.
And it's also about, I'm guessing, those programs being designed in such a way that they meet the needs of a working individual, an individual with a family at home. So
That's right.
Thinking a little bit less about traditional seat time.
That's right.
And maybe thinking about certifying competencies that adult learners already have.
That's right. So there is both, what is appealing about short-term credential programs is the short part, right? These are programs that can get you a credential, sometimes in 8 weeks, sometimes in 16 weeks, on up to 2 years. But it's not just the time, right? It's also the recognition of prior learning that comes, the competency-based approach, right? So these are courses that are not about sort of weeding out who can pass an exam or who can't pass an exam. It's about getting people to the point that they've mastered skills. And the key thing is that when we get them to that point of mastering skills, we also have to ensure that those skills are what are in demand in the labor market. So there's a lot of attention that has to be paid to building the right kind of courses, but knowing that when we can get folks to those courses, they offer a sure path to economic success.
Okay, and clearly a job on the other side that values that degree.
That's exactly right.
That credential.
Credential, that's right.
Are there kind of bright spots nationally as you see what different states are doing that you would point to say this city, this state is really getting it right?
So yeah, there's a couple dimensions to what I think good looks like on this question, right? So one is, are we seeing innovation coming from community colleges in particular? Are they developing new kinds of programs? Whether these programs are in healthcare, in technology, in manufacturing, and in some ways, much of the conversation we're having about the essential workforce as we look to what workers are really helping the country respond to the COVID crisis, that's a workforce that really comes through the door of certifications and certificates. These are folks who are going for this kind of training that results not in a degree, but in a certificate or a certification. And so we have to really understand that those programs play an essential part of our kind of economic viability, our public health, public safety. And we have to think about how we support those programs. We're going to need more people in those programs as we continue to have to manage the health crisis that COVID is creating. So we have to think about how we fund and finance them. And as states come into thinking about their response to COVID, investing in those programs will be very critical. Other dimensions of what has to happen here is states have to think about how they can actually engage adults. So a neighbor, Tennessee, has done a lot of work trying to help both incentivize adults through making the cost of going back less expensive. They've also done great work on sort of marketing the idea of going back. And so we've got to think deliberately about states that are really crafting a message that speaks to the specific challenges that adults have with getting back into post-secondary education. And then I think we've also seen efforts around redesigning. How do we build programs that are better set up to encourage success for people who are working and raising families while they're trying to go to school?
Great. Now, Chauncy, let's just unpack for a minute. When you say short-term credentials, that's 2-year degrees and sub 2-year degrees.
That's right.
Correct? So just unpack that for us for a minute. What does that look like? Most folks, they kind of understand the associate degree.
Sure. So, maybe it's helpful to go to the slide that we have that shows
Sure.
attainment in Kentucky.
Okay.
All right, go to the next slide, please.
There we go.
Great. So what you see here is data that comes from a project on the Lumina website called Stronger Nation. And in Stronger Nation, we show what attainment looks like. We show attainment for the country at large, and then we broke it down by state and by region. It's a great tool if you're interested in playing around with the data. It's there for anybody to use. But what we see here in Kentucky is that Kentucky has set itself a goal of having 60% of adults have a credential of value by 2030. And where you are is that you're just about at 50%. And that 50% includes what you might expect: 10% of Kentucky residents, graduate professional degrees, 16% of bachelor degrees, close to 10% have associate degrees. But there's another 13%, right? So a very large piece of who's got a credential who have either certificates or certifications. And let me say a little bit about each of those if you're not familiar with them. Certificates are awarded by schools, by educational institutions. They're typically focused on a specific occupation. So in healthcare, that might be something like respiratory tech, or that might be something in manufacturing or in technology. And like a degree, their value kind of continues across your career. Certifications are awarded by industry, and they recognize the mastery of a skill set that is important for that particular industry. Typically, you might take a series of courses at a community college and then go sit for the exam. They're offered again separately. And you also then, and they're defined around mastery of a very specific skill set. So again, for adults who really want to understand, if I master this, will that lead to a job? Certifications really make that transparent. And then the last thing I'll say about certifications is that you often have to renew them to demonstrate your ongoing mastery. So that you can see where the state is. You also see, though, the large number of adults that currently just have a high school diploma. And then you have that's about 27%. And then you have another 12% who have some college no degree. And we really have to think about how we make the case to both these groups that additional learning will be essential for their ability to continue to succeed in the labor market. Obviously, that was true before COVID. COVID has now only made that more true as people are facing the prospects of job loss, the need to reskill, to upgrade skills, and shifting over to other industries. And let me say that for lots of people, that will mean combining different types of credentials here. So you might have a 2-year degree, but you might realize, well, to get into this new emerging sector, I need to get a certification that goes with that degree, right? So it's not always the case that retooling means you go back to zero and start over and have to get a 2 or 4-year degree. A lot of times it's that you're adding and stacking additional credentials on top of what you already have to make yourself a fit for new kinds of job opportunities.
And I think it's so important, Chauncey, that you noted the resiliency factor of additional education through times of economic downturn. So we're certainly experiencing that now with COVID, but we have a very recent example of the Great Recession and how individuals and families fared through that Great Recession relative to the level of education.
Right.
And so individuals with higher levels of education fared much better. And so for Kentucky, for communities across Kentucky, for Kentucky as a state, individuals to be much more resilient as we experience bumps, hiccups in our economy, increasing an individual's educational attainment is one way to strengthen their position.
That's right. And if we can switch to the next slide, let me say a little bit more about moving forward. So the data in the Stronger Nation website also has some predictive capabilities. So here I brought some of the data about what Kentucky needs to do to get to 60% attainment by 2030. And importantly, one of the things we show in the Stronger Nation data are the equity gaps that we face as a nation and we face in different states. Because attainment rates are not the same across racial and ethnic groups. If we look at attainment for AA degrees and higher, in Kentucky, we see that African Americans, Hispanics, and Native Americans are roughly at 26 or 27%, and that compares to 35% for whites. And so part of the response has to be understanding what can be done to help these groups increase their attainment rates. If we just get to attainment and we have these persistent equity gaps, we haven't really reached the goal we set out for ourselves, right? This is not simply a numbers exercise. This is about ensuring that there is opportunity for all and that nobody is not getting opportunity based on their race or ethnicity. And so what we see here is that for the state as a whole, to get to the goal in 2030, you need to increase attainment by 13%. But if we think about African Americans, it's 10%. For whites, it's 13%. And then for Hispanics, it's 11%. And so it's important to keep an eye on understanding which one of these strategies will speak to and have the greatest impact of which kind of population.
Mm-hmm. And what specific support strategies a state needs to design to attract and support those individuals.
That's exactly right.
As they enter and persist.
That's right.
And so I think in Kentucky, and I know a number of other states, we passed a performance-based funding model
right.
A couple of years ago that basically provides incentives, supports for institutions to ensure that they are attracting the right students and from an equity standpoint and supporting them to complete. And so that model is working.
That's right. And that's an essential step that states need to take. At a very core level, it's about recognizing that what we're trying to do here is get people skills that have value. And when we move away from the 4-year degree, that is a very different proposition. That is about saying the system needs to be skill focused. It needs to be making sure that people are getting to the skill and often cases the credential that then translate into labor market value. When we talk about degrees, we're more confident that a degree has enough of a signal to employers that there'll be demand. There's variation there, and it's important to pay attention to the ways in which certain kinds of degrees have greater payoff than other kinds of degrees. But when we talk about these shorter term credentials, it's really essential to understand that the institution has to be designed around the idea that if we aren't getting students credentials that have labor market value, we've failed. We failed students, and we failed the employers who rely on the trained talent that comes out of community colleges to meet their labor needs.
Yeah, great, good. Chauncy, thank you. And the data is really so helpful. The Prichard Committee has just sunsetted a decades-long campaign calling for Kentucky to move into the top 20 of all states. And so we've just completed that campaign, and we'll be launching a new campaign at the end of this annual meeting, which we're excited about. But what we know from that decades-long campaign is that Kentucky ranks 19th nationally right now for post-secondary graduation from two-year public institutions. So we've really done well there, and can be proud of that progress. Unfortunately, we still rank 39th in the nation when it comes to adults 25 to 34 with a bachelor's degree or higher. So while our institutions have been doing really good work in the last few years to increase that attainment rate, and the performance-based funding model has been part of that, we have a ways to go if we think about ourselves relative to other states, having that competitive, I think, advantage, economic advantage.
I think that's right.
Yeah, so great. Well, on that note, Chauncy, let's talk about then, social and economic mobility of folks. So that's, a big reason that we, an organization like the Prichard Committee, a state, would focus on increasing educational attainment to realize greater social mobility, economic mobility. Even with the increases in education outcomes that Kentucky has realized in the last couple decades, we still rank at the bottom of the national rankings in poverty. Much of your career you've spent focused on increasing mobility for low-wage workers. So what would you say are the top 3 to 5 priorities for a poor state like Kentucky to focus in on to increase mobility through increase of education?
Sure. So, at the risk of repeating myself a little bit, I would really start by saying, more opportunities that are on the short-term credential side of the spectrum are essential. Partly that's because when we look at, adults who are working, earning low wages, needing to keep up with the increasing skill demands in our economy. Those are the folks who are both often at the sort of lower levels of income and most vulnerable to slipping. And so helping those workers connect with opportunities to build the right kind of skills is essential. Let me say a little bit more about that, though, because we have a world in which these programs exist, but many of them are not actually connecting adults to the right kinds of credentials. The US labor market has over 730,000 different credentials, right? How it is anybody navigates through that sea of credentials, and it's a world in which we don't actually do very much to help people understand, which are the valuable ones, which ones have our quality investments of time and resources. So we need to build programs where employers are really sitting down with community colleges and other education providers, technical colleges, and anyone else who's in the skill provision game, and really helping them understand what they're looking for. We can't afford, if the goal is to help adult workers, we can't afford to put them into programs that don't get them the skills that they need, right? That's just not, we don't have the time, we don't have the money. And so what we need to do is ensure that when we build these programs, that they are designed with a clear understanding of what the labor market looks like. One thing that Kentucky has done really well is actually innovate many of these programs. In Louisville, Kentuckiana Works, the Louisville Region Workforce Board has done some of the most innovative programs that we see across the country. There's Code Louisville, which is focused on getting adults tech credentials, and that's done tremendous work. There's Kentuckiana Builds, which is about the construction industry, which is giving low-income adults opportunities to build skills and step into that industry. And then there's the Kentucky Manufacturing Career Center, which again is taking a kind of industry focus and ensuring that that the industry needs are reflected and aligned to the training that's available. These are all programs that are shorter term, designed around credentials, allow students to go get one credential and then come back over time and get additional credentials so they move up in the industry. But it's essential to think about getting more of these programs that can really meet the needs that low-income adults have. That's, I think, one of the sort of key kind of ways in which we're going to respond to poverty. A second one I would add would be, and I spoke about this, I think, earlier in our conversation, we've got to do more around helping people navigate. As I said, it's very confusing. If you're an adult and you're working, understanding, how do I take that next step? Where do I go? What kind of skills do I need? What jobs are available? People have networks that they get information, but that's rarely enough to really help them figure out this sort of complex set of often shifting information. And so building a more robust world in which, students in high school, students in, college, whether it's a 2 or 4 year program, and the whole world of adults can actually get the resources and the information they need to make informed choices is an essential component of how we're going to keep people, kind of keep them in the labor market and help them get to jobs that pay better wages. And then the last thing I'll say is that we need to think about redesigning post-secondary institutions so they're more focused on the concept of student success. We have far too many people who start and don't succeed. And then the pipeline is too leaky. And for many people, they're working, many of them feel angry that they even tried to go for it into a post-secondary program because it ended up not working out. It was confusing. Often they end up sort of dropping out. They end up without any skills and they end up in debt. And so it feels like I would have been better off not to go. So we need to design the institutions that really allow people who are leading complicated lives to figure out how they can get from sort of into the program, enroll, and complete. And that the institutions have not been designed with the understanding the realities of today's students well enough.
And that's really important for first generation students
Precisely.
as well, right? Adults, first generation students, that clarity, that transparency, that support.
That's right.
And I think that's one of the things that we see happening really well in Kentucky with the performance-based funding model is figuring out those student support services, which can be different depending on the student, the population you're thinking about.
That's exactly right.
Yeah. Chauncy, Kentucky Fame is something that a lot of Kentuckians know about. Toyota's Kentucky Fame. So, and I think it's a model that's on your radar as kind of a best practice between credentialing and the industry, right?
That's right. So, Kentucky's Fame is an example that people point to across the country. I mean, what the lesson to take away from Kentucky Fame is that we have to devote time and resources to connecting industry with education and training, right? There isn't going to be some kind of lucky, happy coordination, right? There needs to be a strong partnership that endures over time, that is able to shift, right? One of the things that KY Fame has done really well is employers' skill needs shift over time. And we need to get that information into the hands of training providers so that they can adapt the training they're offering. They can then signal to their partners so that the sort of bridge programs, the pre-training programs can adapt so that we're building a kind of flywheel in which the needs are sort of well understood and we have time to build the pipelines of people who will get these skills. And that requires, a kind of a durable connection. Oftentimes we think about the employer community college partnership as something that's sort of more advisory. They show up, employers show up and sort of talk once a quarter. The KY Fame model is not about talking once a quarter. It's about sitting down at a table, essentially with sort of the talent blueprints about what's needed and really building. That's right.
Yeah.
And
go ahead.
We don't often think about that as an equity story, but really that is when we're going to create opportunities opportunity for people who have been locked out, who haven't been given the chance to move into industries that pay good wages and offer good benefits. These are the programs that are actually doing that kind of work.
And I think we see that happening in a variety of industries, and you've mentioned them in Kentucky through maybe our Kentucky Chamber of Commerce workforce talent pipeline, which if I'm not incorrect here, Chauncy, that may have had support from JP Morgan Chase.
That it did indeed, yes. Yep.
Okay. Okay.
And again, that's also, you know, I think the goal behind that is, you know, and that's, I think, speaks to your audience. This is, we're not going to solve this problem with educators alone. Right? We're not going to solve this problem with finding people who are interested and eager to go pursue training, right? We're going to solve this problem also by getting employers at the table, employers usually organized by sector and really sort of co-designing, as you said. We're also going to solve it by making sure that the resources, the public resources we're investing are really aligned with these outcomes, right? Again, you've taken a good step with the performance-based funding, but there's more to do around making sure that the dollars we spend are really connected to the industries that are growing.
Mm-hmm. So let's talk a minute about quality degrees and credentials. That's a word, quality, that I think really deserves some definition and some conversation. And I want to talk about that through the lens of also thinking about the connection to industries in the state and what that income looks like. How do we think about quality through the lens of income? If we're thinking about social and economic mobility, we want to be able to move people down a path that allows them not only to make a family sustaining wage, but to begin to be able to build wealth over time.
That's right. So, you know, the quality issue shows up across all this work. But when we think about credentials, I think it's really important to go back to this point I made before about, you know, there's lots of them, 730,000 different credentials, right? And so if you can't look into that huge number of credentials and begin to sort them, we don't have good transparency around you know, what is the return to these credentials, right? Which ones actually get me to the better jobs that pay better wages, right? That's a huge problem. It's one Lumina has been focused on solving and many other actors, but we really have to sort of keep that at the top of the list. This is an area where states are showing a lot of leadership and building out criteria for how they allow their dollars to be spent. You know, for the workforce wonks who are listening in, there's the education training provider list. That's essentially the list the state keeps of what they'll allow dollars to be spent on for different kinds of credentials. And, you know, it's hard in some ways to keep that list, the issues you just raised. How do we make sure that on that list we're capturing the growing areas of the economy, the credentials that matter? And that's an important thing for states to really invest in. We have to start using labor market data, talking with employers, looking at the returns to credential attainment so that we can really be driving the system towards the right kind of credentials. So oftentimes it's a greater state engagement around managing that list so that we're not letting dollars be spent on credentials that don't have a real return. So that's really critical.
So as Lumina thinks about quality, is there a wage differential that you're looking at, a premium over a high school diploma that indicates that a degree or credential is of quality?
So we encountered, so when you look at the Stronger Nation data, or here, let me give you one example of how we've been confronted this issue. So in the Stronger Nation data, we've actually just recently added in certifications. And we didn't add them in at first because there's the data is not as robust when it comes to certifications. And we couldn't really tell, you know, were certifications having the kind of benefit to those who receive them as other kinds of credentials. And as the data got better, we began to see that there were a set of credentials that were returning wages that were 10% greater than someone who was in the industry with just a high school diploma. And that made us feel like, all right, if we can sort of see that, you know, there's at a minimum a kind of 10% differential, that felt like in a sort of crude sort of wage dimension, but that was an important thing that we used as a measure for us around what certifications counted, right? So the way we think about Stronger Nation, we don't count just any credential. We define credentials as having value. And when it comes to certificates and certifications, we look very much at the wage component of that. And likewise, if you were recommending to your neighbor or a relative, well, what to do, what should I go for? Obviously, one of the first things you would say is, let's look at the credentials and make sure that this credential has a return. Now, there's lots of variation to credentials, right? So some credentials that are valuable in Kentucky have no value in Washington State, right? And vice versa. So it's important to recognize that industries, there's lots of variation here. The way industries, the way certain employers respond to credentials is not the same everywhere. So you've got to look at the data. You've got to go test that data against your local, your region. But when you do those things, you can get to a place where you understand which ones are returning value. Let me say another thing though, but quality is not simply about the wage differential. Quality is also about what do the programs you're entering into, right? If people are entering into programs and no one's completing, right, that's another problem, right? So we have to also think about what's happening when it comes to instructional design, what happens in the classroom, right? You mentioned earlier the key component we know in many of these programs around work-based learning. How are we building programs that allow students to have opportunities to go into the actual workplace, right, as they're learning? That's an incredibly important part of how students actually build the kind of experience and networks that take them from school into the workplace. And so we have to also evaluate programs not simply on what's happening on the wage front, but is the value, the experience of the program, does that also speak to a set of quality criteria?
Yeah, that's great. So Chauncey, I think we have a question from a viewer that's perfect at this moment in time, it sounds like, as you talked about completion.
Sure.
So Bren Martin asked, I think the 2-year and certification route could be more accommodating if they also provide a continuum to go forward without losing credits and too short of a time and having to start over later. How can we get colleges to accept that, to accept a pathway? I think maybe on-off ramps, I think Bren's talking about.
Right. So this speaks to, again, a kind of a somewhat wonky term called stackability, right? So, too many community colleges, the way the programs are designed is that you can take a couple steps forward, but if you want to shift over or if you take time off, in essence, you have to come back and start over, right? And that really is a huge barrier, right? What we need are programs where each step allows you to think about each step as a kind of building block. Sometimes we talk about this as unbundling, so that it's not the case if you don't make it to the 2-year degree, all of a sudden everything is lost. It's that, well, if I could start with a certificate, right? If I spend 6 months and I get the certificate, I can come back and I can add on to that certificate with another certificate. And then over time, those courses, those credits build towards a 2-year degree. That is really, there's sort of two, I think, dimensions of that. That is a design feature of community colleges. And that has to do with leadership and faculty and really building programs that allow for this kind of trajectory through. I have a favorite example, Lenore Community College in North Carolina. So there, through economic development dollars, they built a manufacturing program that was designed for the needs of some of the aerospace supply chain businesses in the region. It was actually on the non-credit side. So students didn't even get credit. It was an 8-week course, but after the 8 weeks when they completed, they could typically get a job with one of the large employers in the region. The course was hugely successful. Lots of people wanted that opportunity to get the skills and get into that industry. Over half the employees at some of the biggest firms came from this program. But over time, the college realized that many of those students were going to want to come back and build on what they did there and get credit and potentially get a 2-year degree. And so the college built a sort of 2-year manufacturing program, but they also then allowed those non-credit courses to actually stack towards the credential. And so that took a lot of wrangling with the faculty to sort of figure out how to actually acknowledge it in a way that everybody felt was reasonable, but it's doable. And what that meant is that many of the people who started out thinking, I just want to get in and get into the job, have come back over time and built towards a degree. And so I think that's really what we aspire to, is letting it be the case that there are multiple pathways into these kinds of learning opportunities, and that none of them force you to come back and start over if you want to go on to the next step.
And I know there are, different views as a conversation about kind of micro and macro credentialing has evolved. But essentially, Chauncy, that's sort of what you're talking about, right? That there are that even smaller learning components are valued in the workplace because you're skilling up in a particular area.
That's exactly right. And I think we have to sort of get a little more sophisticated about how we think about this, because there are some industries where in some ways you really just one credential can get you in, right? You get one certification, and the nature of that industry is that once you get in, you can sort of climb a ladder. You'll maybe get more certifications over time, but really, it's like a ticket to entry, and that's fine, right? If that's actually how it works, and that's what not everybody wants to spend a lot of time going back to school, but they should understand the terms of that, and it should really deliver on that promise. Other industries, you're going to want to stack credentials. You're going to want to sort of create a kind of constellation of credentials. Maybe as you sort of see a job that's sort of a lateral move, you're going to want to add different kinds of credentials, whether it's a micro credential or a different kind of certificate of certification. And again, we've got to sort of allow that to happen in a more flexible way so that people can sort of move through the labor market in ways that are really more responsive to the kind of ways in which the economy has grown. One last innovation I'll add is that increasingly, I think community colleges are also recognizing that there should be credentialing as you go, right? So maybe you start out and your goal is a 2-year degree, but if in the first 6 months you've actually gotten a credential, you've sort of done something that's worthy of either going out and getting a certification or getting a credential, the program should be designed in that way, so that it's not so high stakes, right? Because if you're going to drop out after a year, it's far better to take a break. If you're going to take a break after a year, it's better to do that with at least some kind of credential in your pocket, right?
Right.
If we hold that out to the end, we know that for the students who don't make it, it means that it's kind of been a zero-sum experience. And we want to design it so that everyone who's coming into post-secondary is able to get some kind of recognition of the learning they've done when they go back out or they take a break, as many students do.
Yeah. That's great, Chauncy. We call this broadcast Innovations in Education for a reason, right? Because we want to identify those innovations that will help Kentucky turn the corner, turn the curve on the inside of the track, right? Not on the outside and behind. So that's one to note that I know folks in the state are already thinking deeply about and working on, that we could leverage. So I want to talk about another piece of quality here, and that's the competencies, the skills that folks build through post-secondary degrees, and how we're understanding the value of those skills and competencies. Jean Wilhoit, who's listening tonight, asked, if you have to build a strong case for identifying and developing marketable skills, how important is the development of generic skills and dispositions?
Mm-hmm. So, this is one of the eternal questions in the world of kind of post-secondary education. And, sometimes it's framed as hard skills versus soft skills. Sometimes it's framed as, I've spent a career listening to employers say, I don't care about I can teach them the technical stuff. They just need to show up on time and know how to work as a team and know how to talk, to their colleagues. So I think the first thing to acknowledge is that we don't know necessarily enough about this issue, and it's always surprising to me when I think about it, like how something so fundamental could be something we're still struggling to really sort of wrap our hands around. I think there's a couple sort of dimensions of why we struggle with this. One is that employers, they sometimes themselves don't help us really understand what exactly they're looking for. Sometimes employers are not actually the best narrator of their own situation. And so, they'll say on the one hand, we just care about a certain set of, sometimes they're called horizontal skills or foundational skills. But in truth, when we look at their behavior, they hire for a certain set of very technical skills. And there's a tremendous variation, right? Certain industries, healthcare, that are more regulated, right? You need a certain kind of technical credential to sort of get into that industry. So I think one of the things we have to recognize is that we have to sort of unpack a little bit more what it is employers are actually looking for. And employers have to do more to help us understand, what are the actual non-technical skills that they're looking for? And, in what ways would they actually believe that a credential recognizes those skills?
Okay.
Right? Because that's a big part of it. I think we've had multiple, and many people are trying that right now. They've tried to create credentials that are about, these more, horizontal skill sets. There's not a lot of evidence that employers actually, respond to them, that they actually hire for those skills. That doesn't mean employers don't care about this issue, right? It doesn't mean employers don't want people who can demonstrate that they do have these kinds of skills. It just means that it's not clear that the way credentials, the credentials capture a lot of that when it comes to employer behavior.
So the work of Quality Assurance Commons is one that's kind of trying to lead in that space to better understand what post-secondary institutions are building in and how we actually measure that. It's not something we're going to measure on a standardized assessment. It's really something that's much more about observation. And I would argue an individual knowing that part of what they're doing in their program, whether it's secondary school or post-secondary school, an individual knowing that part of what they're doing is building those skills and competencies that are valuable.
That's precisely it. And I think this speaks to the importance of work-based learning opportunities, right? I think when we look back at what were the best quality, whether it's adult or high school career technical education, what made those things high quality was that there was a tight linkage with the industry. And you had contact with people who were working in the industry, and you were able to, in essence, absorb a lot of these horizontal skills through those experiences. And, in many sense, those are skills in some ways best mastered through actually experiencing them. It's very hard and sometimes to teach those in the context of a classroom. And so, I think one of the things I think we have to recognize is if we really are serious about providing those skills, we got to be even more serious about ensuring then that people have more opportunity to get into the workplace. Yeah. Because that's, I think, where people are going to best be able to understand why those skills are valuable, what they are, and why mastering them is an important part of being a successful employee.
So on that note, Chauncy, a little bit of a pivot, because we could go down so many different roads in this conversation, right? When we think about work ready, so Erin Thompson, who's watching tonight, president of our Council on Post-Secondary Education, asked about reflections on Kentucky's Work Ready Scholarship. Mm-hmm. And so as I ask you that question about work ready scholarships, if you'll also reflect on a number of states' movement toward free college, particularly in the, I think, sub-associate or associate degree space.
Yep. So, I know Aaron. I'm thrilled that he's joining us. So let me speak about the free college first. So, I think there's a complexity. There's some debate about sort of the free college approach, and if I can sort of summarize that debate, there's some who feel like, well, especially for lower income students, maybe tuition isn't the sole barrier, right? There are other barriers that come with getting, persisting and completing. And those have to do with a lot of sort of non-academic or non-tuition costs, right? So that's transportation, that's childcare, that's books. And to the extent that those programs didn't cover those costs, it wasn't really getting at what in some ways was the core barriers. Now, there's lots of variation. There's no one kind of free college program, right? So it's a little bit of that many free college programs have tried to think about and address some of those issues. But I think the thing that I am most struck with when it comes to one of the power of sort of free college is that it is about signaling to people who often find it very confusing, as anyone would, to understand the actual cost of post-secondary education, right? We don't do enough to make navigation easy. And so what I think free college it does often is help people understand, no, this can be free or at very reduced cost. I'm not taking the risk of enrolling only to discover that the costs were far greater or far more kind of, I couldn't predict them or I couldn't anticipate them. And so it's important, I think, to recognize that for many people, going to pursue a post-secondary degree or a post-secondary credential, they don't do it because it's got so much, it's opaque and it's got a lot of risk attached to it. And so the more we can do, and this is, I think, the Workforce Ready grants, I think the more we can make it kind of a more sort of turnkey, or make the terms of what's going to happen kind of transparent, the more we're going to see people being willing to pursue this kind of learning. But until that happens, we have to recognize that, sorry about that. Sorry about that, my apologies. Until that happens, we're going to be, really, it's going to mean that for lots of people, it's just not going to feel like an option because it's going to just feel too complex and too confusing and, quite honestly, too risky when it comes to cost.
So I think such an important note that you made, that we can do free college, but if we don't think about the other things that folks need to persist, the other supports that they need, we're probably missing part of the conversation. So Tamara Lynn, who's watching, asks, would you please share any best practices you're aware of to reduce barriers to entry to programs, which is what you're talking about there. So example, companies allowing employees to attend classes or training on the clock, upfront tuition payments as opposed to reimbursement from companies, childcare considerations.
So yes to all those. I'll say more about them. Let me sort of split it into maybe two pools. So one pool is the folks who aren't kind of currently working, right? Or the folks that the employer, in some cases, the employer could play a role with a lot of the programs we just heard about. But when we're talking about the 36 million adults with some college, no degree, one of the things we've discovered is that one way to sort of get people back in is to offer either a kind of first course free, or we're seeing some communities doing a kind of debt cancellation, right? So it's really recognizing that for many people, a key barrier to going back is the sense that, you know what, it's either I owe money, and even if it's I owe a couple $100 in old parking tickets, right? That's enough to keep people away. Or that, it's risky, and again, I'm not sure I want to do it. So if I could start and not have to take on paying that first course free, those seem to be important ways to induce getting people back in. Now, if we shift and talk about the people who are in, then there's a whole world of things we need to do, right? So one of the ones that is really important is co-requisite remediation. So that is ensuring that when you get there, you're not spending all your time going through remedial courses. We know that's one of the things that really, is discouraging. So thinking about how we build in those kinds of coursework into high school or other kinds of programs, so that when people get there, they feel like they can get started, right? Like this is another key. Momentum is kind of critical. That it's hard enough, but if you go and you spend your first year just trying to sort of satisfy some of this sort of remediation work and are sort of endlessly searching for courses that don't actually fit the kind of goal you have in terms of the degree or credential, that's very discouraging. So aligned with that is another effort which often goes by the term guided pathways. So that's, again, designing the sort of the course continuum or the course progression in ways, in some ways, that has a little bit less choice. I think we have a challenge with the community college model where too much choice is disabling. We've had lots of great work from behavioral economists that really have shown us that when we flood the zone with too many options, people aren't able to move forward. So really innovative community colleges, community college systems in Louisiana, they've redesigned the whole system to sort of create more kind of sort of nested. Louisiana has sort of 7 different areas, whether it's healthcare or manufacturing or transportation, that are kind of families of skills. And so students don't have to choose. They can sort of see where they want to head and move in that direction without having to sort through all this choice. Then we get to student support. There's tremendous amount, whether it's access to childcare, transportation. There's really critical needs there that we know. And food security is another one that has been getting more attention, but we need to do much more to ensure that students who are in school, have access to food. It's hard to learn if you're constantly, not getting the right kind of nutrition. So, all that work alongside, I think, the work around tuition that the free college effort represents.
Yeah, so an array of supports there for continuing education, some borne by the private employer, others borne by the public sector, some about systemic change to how we approach folks earning credits. So the co-requisite piece.
Let me add, I should have, I didn't, let me just say one quick word about employers, right? So we are seeing innovation from employers who also recognize, especially for their incumbent workforce, we're seeing a kind of a tuition assistance 2.0, right? If tuition assistance, the old version was just, here, take this benefit and do what you want. Increasingly employers are saying, no, let's think about this benefit in a way that's sort of designed around both your own, the worker's career goals, and the firm's kind of skill needs, and really trying to tie it more to a very specific kind of trajectory, which I think, and then increasingly recognizing that lowering the costs of helping students connect to the right kind of provider, sort of tying access to courses to the workday. Lots of great work happening there. We need more of it, but we've taken some important first steps.
Yeah, great, Chauncy, thank you. And as we're nearing the top of our hour, the conversation always goes so fast when we get into a kind of rich conversation as we have. I want to remind folks who are listening that there have been questions posted in the Facebook comments that you can respond to in an app called slido.com. Answers to those questions from folks listening in will help the Prichard Committee design its next strategic plan. So we hope you'll take a few minutes to answer those questions. You'll find them in the comments. So Chauncy, as we wrap up for the night, I want to bring us down to K12 because we're talking about the future of work and learning. And post-secondary must be a priority strategy for a state like Kentucky to move ahead and provide a richer quality of life for individuals and our state. But it starts in K12. We can argue it starts in early childhood, but specifically with K12 education, as we find ourselves in a moment where there's some wrestling over what good education reform looks like. We know we need a richer vision for education that really sets young people up for success on their post-secondary path. Mm-hmm. What are you seeing in your work that are good examples of K-12 institutions getting it right to support learners through an equity lens to be prepared for success in post-secondary?
It's really a great question. And in some ways I want to start by talking about one of the things that's happening in post-secondary. So when we look at post-secondary, we're seeing the line between the for-credit side of a community college and the non-credit side blurring, right? That institutions realizing like those are sort of not the right distinctions, right? If you've come, you want to learn, you should have lots of pathways to move forward. I think we're going to see the same thing when it comes, especially to the sort of the 9th to 12, the high school to post-secondary. That really what a great system is going to do is start early, whether it's middle school or 9th grade, around sort of thinking about careers, helping students really think about what the high school experience does in terms of a larger career trajectory. And so that when you exit high school, maybe you've just gotten a credential and you're going right to the labor market. Maybe you're going to a community college and you're going to do 2 years because you want a 2-year degree and you'll come back later. Or maybe you're doing it, you've identified a career and you go on to, that's what's helped you to figure out what kind of 4-year degree you want to get. But we, in the US, unlike most of our kind of competitor nations, we wait till much too late to start talking to young people about careers. We wait much too late to actually think about how we start helping them navigate. And we have a complicated legacy. We have, of course, a really ugly history of tracking. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. But I don't think the reaction to that, the right response to that is to sort of then never think about how we help students get on pathways. I think we've got to now recognize that helping students understand what their options are, that they have more than one option when it comes to post-secondary. It's not just a BA or bust. And then ensuring that everybody has a fair chance, but is able to choose the kind of path that makes sense for them is critical. And I think that means we're going to have to invest more in some of these other pathways because we have underinvested in what it means to go post-high school, but not get a BA.
Yeah.
And I think, a high school that really can think about how they help their students begin to decide what their sort of career interests are is really going to be, well positioned and serving its students better.
And possibly recognizing that positioning education in that application space, in that relevancy space of what we do with knowledge, what an individual chooses to do with knowledge, in that deeper learning space is actually where we can deliver content mastery.
That's
So
right.
mathematics, I think, is a great example. So providing spaces for application through pathways, through career and technical education can actually be a vehicle to delivering mastery in mathematics.
And one of the greatest insights we see from the data on high school career technical education is that students who do high school CTE are often more motivated to go get a four-year degree. It's that experience of having a kind of a rich and sort of a fully contextualized learning experience that then helps form their interest in going further when they leave high school.
Yeah, excellent. So ultimately, as we continue to work on these issues, work on issues in post-secondary, in K12, we think about a big, bold future. We want to position Kentuckians to fill the jobs that are available today, without a doubt. But we also want to provide an education system that allows Kentuckians to be the job creators of Kentucky's future. And so we look forward to continuing this conversation as we move forward. I want to thank everybody for listening in tonight. Please continue the commenting. If you're new to the Prichard Committee and you're listening in tonight for the first time, please know that you can get more information about our work and be part of a shared vision to improve the state through education by joining the Groundswell Initiative. And there will be a link in the comments to do that. So Chauncy, again, thank you so much for taking time out of a Wednesday night to share with us your thoughts about how we can improve in Kentucky. And I want to note for everyone once again that while we're all experiencing the pain going on in Louisville, we have this conversation tonight in honor and in memory of Breonna Taylor and all those struggling for racial equity and justice in Kentucky and across our nation. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Well, and have a good evening. Thank you, Kenya.